The heavy mahogany door slammed shut, echoing like a gunshot through the freezing Seattle downpour. Stripped of everything by the family she trusted, she was left to die in the storm. But the monster she found in the dark woods didn't bare his fangs. He simply welcomed her home. The freezing November rain battered Clara's face, washing away the tears she refused to let them see her shed. She stood on the sprawling, immaculate front steps of the Carlisle estate in Medina, Washington, a multi-million-dollar fortress of glass, steel, and ruthless ambition. Behind her, the massive front door remained bolted shut. At her feet, a single battered leather suitcase lay half open in a muddy puddle, its contents rapidly soaking through. Just 30 minutes ago, Clara Hayes had possessed a life most people envied. She was the wife of Dominic Carlisle, heir to a massive Pacific Northwest shipping empire. But the illusion of her perfect marriage had shattered with sickening violence when she returned home early from a charity gala. She hadn't found her husband reviewing quarterly reports in his study. Instead, she found him in their marital bed, tangled in the imported silk sheets, with Jessica Farnsworth Clara's maid of honor, her supposed best friend since their days at the University of Washington. The betrayal had paralyzed Clara, but it was the aftermath that completely destroyed her. When the screaming match had erupted and moved to the grand foyer, Clara had expected her in-laws to show a shred of decency. Instead, Beatrice Carlisle, a matriarch whose veins ran with ice water and old money, had stepped out of the private elevator. Beatrice didn't look at her cheating son with disdain. She looked at Clara with absolute triumph. "I told you on your wedding day that a girl from a 2-bedroom apartment in Tacoma would never truly belong in this family." Beatrice had said, her voice dropping to a lethal quiet purr as she motioned for the private security guards. "Dominic has needs. You were merely a placeholder, Clara. A quaint little distraction until he was ready for a woman of actual pedigree. Jessica understands our world. You just live in it." Clara had turned to her father-in-law Arthur Carlisle, who simply adjusted his Rolex and looked away. She had turned to Dominic, the man who had vowed to protect her, but he was already pouring himself a glass of Macallan 25, refusing to even meet her eyes. "Leave the keys to the Mercedes on the console." Dominic had muttered, his voice void of any warmth. "My lawyers will send the annulment papers to your mother's house. The prenup is ironclad, Clara. You get nothing." They had confiscated her phone, claiming it was purchased on the company account. They had taken her coat, a gift from Beatrice that the older woman viciously reclaimed, stating Clara no longer had the right to wear the Carlisle name on her back. And then the security guards had physically shoved her out into the worst atmospheric river Seattle had seen in a decade. Now shivering violently in a thin emerald evening gown, Clara stared at the imposing iron gates of the estate as they locked her out. The sheer cruelty of it was suffocating. She had given 5 years of her life to Dominic. She had nursed him through a severe bout of pneumonia, covered for his reckless financial mistakes, and played the perfect smiling socialite for his family's endless PR campaigns. In return, she was being discarded like household trash. The wind howled off Lake Washington, cutting through her damp dress like thousands of microscopic glass shards. Hypothermia was not just a distant threat, it was an impending reality. The enclave of Medina was incredibly exclusive, meaning there were no sidewalks, no late-night cafes, and no public transit. The estates were separated by acres of dense primeval evergreen forests and winding unlit asphalt roads. It was a 3-mile walk just to reach the highway, and in this torrential downpour in 3-inch heels, Clara knew she wouldn't make it. She picked up the soaked suitcase, her numb fingers barely able to grip the handle. She kicked off her ruined heels, preferring the freezing abrasive asphalt against her bare feet to the agonizing instability of the stilettos. Step by painful step, she began to walk down the pitch-black road, illuminated only by the occasional crack of lightning that spider-webbed across the charcoal sky. Her mind spiraled into dark, terrified places. She thought of her mother struggling to pay off a second mortgage in Tacoma. She couldn't walk all the way there. She had no money for a cab. The few cars that drove past her, blacked-out Range Rovers and sleek Porsches, didn't even slow down. To the wealthy elite behind those tinted windows, she was just a pathetic, drenched figure to be ignored. The isolation of the affluent suburb was a death trap. After an hour of aimless, agonizing walking, Clara's vision began to blur. Her lips were blue, her teeth chattering so violently that her jaw ached. The edges of her consciousness were fraying, giving way to a dangerous, deceptive warmth that signaled the final stages of hypothermia. She needed shelter. Any shelter. As she stumbled around a sharp bend in the forested road, a violent flash of lightning illuminated something hidden behind a thick wall of ancient, overgrown cedar trees. It was a massive, rusted iron gate, heavily chained, bearing a crest she didn't recognize, a roaring wolf tangled in thorny vines. Beyond the gates, barely visible through the torrential rain, was a dense, overgrown driveway leading deep into a forgotten patch of the woods. Clara remembered the local rumors. The old Ashcroft property. It was the only unrenovated parcel of land in the entire zip code. Real estate developers had been trying to buy the 100-acre plot for decades, but the mysterious owner Nathaniel Ashcroft was practically a ghost. Nobody had seen him in years. The property was abandoned, they said, left to rot. To Clara, an abandoned property meant a porch. It meant a roof. It meant a chance to survive the night. Desperation overriding her fear of trespassing, she squeezed through a narrow gap between the stone pillar and the rusted iron bars, dragging her ruined suitcase behind her, stepping out of the modern world and into a suffocating ancient darkness. The woods on the Ashcroft estate felt fundamentally different from the rest of the neighborhood. The moment Clara slipped past the iron gates, the distant hum of the highway and the glow of the Seattle skyline vanished, swallowed entirely by the dense, towering canopy of centuries-old evergreens. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the smell of ozone just before a lightning strike. She dragged her numb, bleeding feet up the seemingly endless winding driveway. The gravel had long ago surrendered to moss and invasive blackberry brambles that tore at the delicate silk of her dress and scratched deep, stinging lines into her calves. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist in the periphery of her vision. She felt an undeniable primal sensation that she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and a deep shiver that had nothing to do with the freezing rain rolled down her spine. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, her voice cracking, sounding terribly small in the vast emptiness of the woods. Just find a porch, just survive the night. Another jagged flash of lightning tore the sky open, and there it was. Clara gasped, dropping her suitcase. The Ashcroft Manor didn't look like a Pacific Northwest home. It looked like a Gothic nightmare ripped from the cliffs of Victorian England and dropped into the Washington wilderness. It was massive 3 stories of dark, unyielding stone, crowned with sharp turrets and wrought-iron balconies. Gargoyles, their faces eroded by decades of rain, peered down from the gutters. The windows were towering arches of dark glass, reflecting the storm, but offering no light from within. It was terrifyingly silent, exuding an aura of absolute, heavy dread. Yet as another gust of freezing wind hit her, threatening to knock her off her feet, Clara realized she didn't have the luxury of fear. Her core temperature was plummeting. The dark, imposing wooden double doors at the top of the grand stone staircase were her only salvation. She practically crawled up the stone steps, her bare feet leaving faint, bloody footprints on the slick surface. She reached the massive brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head, and with the last ounce of her fading strength, she slammed it against the door 3 times. Thud, thud, thud. The sound echoed hollowly inside. Clara leaned heavily against the freezing wood, her breathing shallow and ragged. Silence answered her. The rumors were right. The place was entirely abandoned. No one was coming to save her. "Please," she sobbed, sliding down the heavy oak door until she collapsed onto the stone porch, curling into a tight, shivering ball. The betrayal of her husband, the cruel sneer of her mother-in-law, the sheer humiliation of it all, finally broke through her shock. She wept into her bruised knees, the cold seeping into her very bones, preparing to close her eyes for the last time. Then she heard it. A heavy metallic clack echoed from within the door, the sound of a deadbolt sliding back. Clara weakly lifted her head. The massive wooden door slowly creaked open, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit foyer. The sudden rush of warm, fire-heated air that washed over her felt like a physical embrace. Framed in the doorway stood a man. Clara's blurred vision struggled to focus, but the sheer, overwhelming presence of him commanded her attention. He was unnervingly tall, dressed in a bespoke, immaculate charcoal three-piece suit that seemed decades out of style, yet perfectly tailored to his broad shoulders. His skin was pale, strikingly almost unnaturally alabaster, contrasting sharply with his dark, perfectly styled hair. But it was his eyes that made Clara's heart stutter in her chest. They were a piercing, luminescent shade of silver, rimmed with a faint, dangerous ring of crimson. He didn't look like a hermit. He didn't look like an eccentric billionaire. He looked like an apex predator, stepping out of a myth. Nathaniel Ashcroft looked down at the bruised, soaked, shivering woman curled on his doorstep. For a fraction of a second, Clara saw a flash of raw, terrifying hunger in those silver eyes, and she braced herself, expecting him to yell to kick her out, or worse. Instead, the dangerous tension in his jaw relaxed. A strange, hauntingly soft expression crossed his aristocratic features. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He didn't ask about the blood on her feet or the tears on her face. He stepped forward, seemingly unfazed by the freezing rain, and effortlessly scooped Clara into his arms as if she weighed no more than a feather. Clara gasped, instinctively gripping the lapels of his suit. His chest was rock-hard, and strangely, terrifyingly, he had no heartbeat. Beneath her frozen ear, there was only absolute dead silence. His skin, where his fingers brushed her bare neck, was as cold as the marble steps she had just collapsed on. "Dominic Carlyle is a fool," the man murmured. His voice was a rich, hypnotic baritone that vibrated through Clara's very soul, laced with an ancient, dangerous power. "I have watched them treat you like a pawn for 5 years, Clara. I was beginning to wonder how much longer you would endure it before you found your way to my door." Clara's eyes widened, her mind struggling to process his words through the haze of hypothermia. He knew who she was. He had been watching. He carried her over the threshold, stepping into the magnificent, impossibly grand foyer, lit by a roaring, massive stone fireplace and dozens of flickering candelabras. He gently kicked the heavy wooden door shut, sealing them inside the fortress, shutting out the storm and the cruel world that had abandoned her. He looked down at her, his crimson-ringed eyes locking onto hers, pulling her into a hypnotic, inescapable trance. He smiled a small, secretive expression that revealed the briefest, terrifying glimpse of elongated, razor-sharp canines. "You are safe now, my queen," Nathaniel whispered, carrying her deeper into the shadows of the manor. "Welcome home." When Clara finally opened her eyes, she was no longer shivering on a freezing stone porch. The agonizing cold that had settled deep into her bones was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, enveloping warmth. She blinked against the soft golden light filtering through heavy velvet curtains. She was lying in the center of a massive antique mahogany four-poster bed, wrapped in layers of thick, downy quilts and incredibly soft Egyptian cotton sheets. The ruined, muddy emerald evening gown she had been wearing was gone. Instead, she was dressed in a pristine, long-sleeved silk nightgown that felt like a second skin. Panic flared in her chest for a fleeting second, but it was quickly quelled by the sheer tranquility of the room. The air smelled of burning cedarwood and a faint, sweet hint of dried roses. "You slept for 2 entire days," a voice resonated from the shadows near the roaring fireplace. Clara gasped, pulling the quilts up to her chin as she sat up. Nathaniel Ashcroft stepped into the soft light, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that no human possessed. He was no longer wearing the formal charcoal suit. Instead, he wore a casually unbuttoned crisp white dress shirt and dark trousers, though the relaxed attire did nothing to diminish the sheer, overwhelming aura of power radiating from him. His pale skin seemed to absorb the firelight, and those piercing silver eyes, still edged with that dangerous ring of crimson, locked onto hers. What are you?" Clara managed to whisper, her voice trembling slightly. The memory of her arrival, the absolute silence in his chest, the freezing touch of his hands, the briefest flash of elongated canines, rushed back to her with terrifying clarity. Nathaniel didn't flinch at her question. He approached the edge of the bed and gently placed a delicate porcelain teacup on the nightstand. "Drink this. It is a blend of herbs designed to restore your red blood cell count. You were dangerously close to organ failure when I brought you inside." He paused, his expression unreadable. "As for what I am, Clara, I believe you already know. The fairy tales your mother read to you in Tacoma were not entirely fiction. They were simply watered-down warnings of the things that rule the shadows." Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to reject the impossibility of his words. Yet her instincts screamed that he was telling the absolute truth. "You're a vampire." "A crude term, but accurate enough for our current conversation," Nathaniel replied smoothly, taking a seat in a velvet armchair beside the bed. "I am the lord of this territory. I have walked the forests of the Pacific Northwest since long before the city of Seattle was even a thought in the minds of industrial men." "Why did you save me?" Clara asked, her grip on the blankets tightening. "Why would someone like you care about a discarded wife?" A dark, dangerous shadow crossed Nathaniel's aristocratic features. "Because, Clara, your marriage to Dominic Carlyle was never a coincidence. It was a calculated, vicious theft engineered by Beatrice Carlyle and the corporate vultures at the Prescott and Hughes law firm." Clara frowned, profound confusion warring with the lingering ache in her heart. "A theft I didn't have anything for them to steal. I grew up with nothing. That was Beatrice's entire problem with me." "That is exactly what they wanted you to believe," Nathaniel explained, his voice dropping to a smooth, lethal register. "Your late father, Thomas Hayes, was a humble man, yes. But his grandfather was one of the original land surveyors of the Washington Territory. Your family name holds the original ironclad mineral and port rights to a 60-mile stretch of the Puget Sound coastline. A dormant holding company called Caldwell Enterprises, the very same coastline where the Carlyle shipping empire operates its most lucrative untaxed offshore freight terminals." Clara's breath hitched as the pieces began to violently snap together in her mind. "The Carlyles discovered this discrepancy 5 years ago." Nathaniel continued, his silver eyes flashing with contempt. "If the state ever audited the original deeds, the Carlyle family would owe billions in back rent and trespassing fines. They would be utterly ruined, bankrupt overnight. So they devised a solution. Dominic was instructed to find you, court you, and marry you. And hidden within that massive, intimidating prenuptial agreement you signed on your wedding day was a quiet, insidious clause." "I signed over Caldwell Enterprises," Clara whispered, the sickening realization making her stomach churn. "I gave them the rights to the land." "Precisely," Nathaniel nodded. "You signed away your birthright without ever knowing it existed. You secured their billionaire status. And once the 5-year statute of limitations on the transfer expired, which happened exactly 2 days ago, you were no longer of any use to them. Jessica Farnsworth brings immediate liquid capital to their failing hedge funds. You were merely the legal bridge they had to cross to secure their stolen empire. Tears of absolute fury pricked Clara's eyes. She hadn't just been betrayed by her husband. She had been meticulously hunted, used and discarded by an entire family of sociopaths. The grief she had felt out in the rain evaporated, replaced by a blinding, white-hot rage. "Why do you know all of this?" Clara demanded, looking fiercely at the immortal creature sitting beside her. "How does my family's land concern you?" Nathaniel leaned forward, the crimson rings in his eyes, expanding, swallowing the silver. "Because, Clara, that land originally belonged to me. The Hayes family were my trusted mortal stewards over a century ago. The Carlyles did not just steal from you. They built their pathetic empire on my sovereign territory, and I have grown exceptionally tired of their noise." He stood up, towering over the bed, extending a pale, flawless hand toward her. "You came to my door seeking shelter. Clara Hayes." Nathaniel murmured his voice, a hypnotic caress that sent a shiver down her spine. "I am offering you much more than that. I am offering you the power to tear their world apart. Stand with me, and we will take back what is ours. We will walk into their fortress, and we will burn the Carlyle name to the ground." Clara looked at his outstretched hand. She thought of Dominic's cold sneer. She thought of Beatrice's triumphant face. She thought of the rain, the mud, and the iron gates locking her out of her own life. She didn't hesitate. Clara reached out, placing her warm human hand into the freezing, immortal grip of the Vampire King. "Burn it all," she whispered. The annual Carlisle Winter Gala was the most exclusive social event of the Seattle elite, held in the breathtaking Spanish ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. Crystal chandeliers dripped with light, reflecting off the diamond necklaces and champagne flutes of the city's billionaires, politicians, and media moguls. Dominic Carlyle stood at the center of the room, looking every bit the triumphant heir in a custom Italian tuxedo. Jessica Farnsworth clung to his arm, wearing a spectacular sapphire gown and a smug, satisfied smile. Nearby, Beatrice Carlyle was holding court with the mayor, basking in the glow of their newly secured, undisputed control over the coastal shipping ports. They were untouchable. They had excised the useless lower-class girl from their pedigree, secured their fortune, and upgraded to a woman of appropriate status. The string quartet was halfway through a delicate waltz when the massive gilded double doors of the ballroom suddenly groaned open with a heavy, unnatural force that silenced the music instantly. The heavy polished oak doors crashed against the walls, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. The temperature in the ballroom plummeted by 10 degrees in a single second, a sudden chilling draft sweeping over the elite crowd. Every eye in the room turned to the entrance. Clara stood in the doorway, completely unrecognizable from the broken, weeping woman they had thrown into the rain 3 nights ago. She wore a breathtaking floor-length gown of liquid black velvet that clung to her curves, slit dramatically up one thigh. Around her neck rested a necklace of flawless, heavy diamonds, and a single massive blood-red ruby that caught the chandelier light like a burning ember. Her hair was swept back into an elegant, commanding style, and her posture was straight, predatory, and radiating absolute power. But it was the man beside her that made the oxygen leave the room. Nathaniel Ashcroft was a terrifying vision of dark elegance. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but he looked less like a wealthy socialite, and more like a god of death gracing them with his presence. His luminescent silver eyes swept over the room, freezing the blood of anyone foolish enough to meet his gaze. "Security!" Beatrice Carlyle snapped her voice, trembling slightly, as the shock wore off her carefully contoured face, twisting into a mask of ugly panic. "Security, remove that woman immediately. She is trespassing." 4 heavily armed private guards stepped forward, reaching for their earpieces. Nathaniel didn't even raise a hand. He merely flicked his silver eyes toward the men. The guards froze mid-step, their expressions going completely slack before they silently turned around and walked out of the ballroom, entirely compelled by the ancient apex predator's will. Murmurs of shock and terror ripped through the wealthy crowd. Dominic dropped his champagne glass. It shattered loudly against the marble floor. "Clara?" Dominic stammered, his face draining of color as she unhooked her arm from Nathaniel's and walked slowly, deliberately toward the center of the room. "What the hell is this? How did you get in here?" "I own the building, Dominic." Nathaniel's voice echoed through the massive ballroom, though he hadn't raised it above a conversational volume. The rich hypnotic baritone vibrated in the chests of everyone present. "Through a subsidiary of Ashcroft Holdings, I suggest you mind your tone when speaking to my fiancée." Jessica Farnsworth gasped, stepping back. Beatrice's jaw dropped. "Fiancé? You're insane, Arthur Carlyle." Dominic's father sputtered, stepping forward. "Ashcroft is a myth, and whoever you are, you have no business here. Clara has been legally removed from this family and all its assets." "Legally removed," Clara repeated, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. She stopped 3 feet away from her former husband. "You mean the fraudulent transfer of Caldwell Enterprises, the one orchestrated by Prescott and Hughes to steal my family's coastal rights." Beatrice visibly staggered, clutching Arthur's arm. The deepest, most damning secret of the Carlyle empire had just been spoken aloud in front of the entire Seattle elite. That transfer was predicated on a legal marriage, Nathaniel stated, coming to stand right behind Clara, his imposing frame casting a long, terrifying shadow over Dominic. "A marriage that your son annulled within the 5-year provisional window stipulated by Washington state inheritance law regarding dormant trusts. A foolish, arrogant mistake. You can't prove that," Dominic whispered, sweating profusely, suddenly realizing he was standing far too close to a man who felt like a walking black hole. "I don't need to." Nathaniel smiled. The ballroom light seemed to dim the shadows, stretching and wrapping around the Carlyle family. To the rest of the room, Nathaniel simply looked intimidating. But for Dominic, Jessica, and Beatrice, Nathaniel allowed his glamour to drop for a fraction of a second. They saw the impossibly sharp fangs. They saw the demonic crimson fire in his eyes. They felt the crushing, suffocating weight of an immortal predator pushing against their fragile human minds. Dominic's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the marble floor, whimpering, covering his head with his hands. Jessica screamed, scrambling backward until she hit a banquet table. Beatrice clutched her chest, her face turning an alarming shade of purple, as she gasped for air that suddenly felt too thick to breathe. "As of this morning," Clara said smoothly, looking down at the pathetic, trembling man she used to love, "Caldwell Enterprises has been legally reabsorbed by Ashcroft Holdings. The state has been notified of your 40-year illegal occupation of the shipping ports. The IRS is currently seizing your corporate accounts, and the FBI is raiding your Medina estate for evidence of corporate fraud." Clara leaned down, her face inches from Dominic's terrified, tear-stained face. "You kicked me out into the rain to die, Dominic," Clara whispered, her voice colder than the storm she had survived. "But all you did was introduce me to the monster in the woods. And he liked me much better than he likes you." She stood up, adjusting her diamond necklace. She didn't look back as Beatrice collapsed to the floor in a dead faint. Nor did she care as the sounds of police sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing through the streets of downtown Seattle. Clara slipped her hand into Nathaniel's freezing grip. He smiled down at her, the crimson rings in his eyes glowing with profound pride and possessive affection. "Shall we go home, my queen?" Nathaniel asked softly. "Yes," Clara replied, walking out of the ruined remnants of her past, stepping into the dark, magnificent eternity of her future. "Take me home." What an absolute thrill ride! If you loved seeing Clara team up with the terrifying and gorgeous Vampire King to utterly destroy the toxic family that betrayed her, give this video a huge thumbs up. Don't forget to share this dark, vengeful romance with your friends, and hit that subscribe button with the notification bell turned on so you never miss our next dramatic story. We want to hear from you. What was your favorite moment of Clara's revenge? Let us know in the comments below.